Hello again. Throughout most of the last century or two, the use of firearms for criminal purposes in Britain has been rare. When they were used, it was almost invariably indoors for domestic murders and bank robberies, that kind of thing. It was generally accepted that only foreigners discharged guns in the street, as was seen, for example, during the so-called Siege of Sydney Street in 1911, with the Lithuanians involved in that. In the last few decades, this has changed, of course, and firearms are used out of doors during gang fights and other criminal enterprises. Such activities are usually, but not of course exclusively, the work of foreigners and immigrants. Some black people appear to have an affinity for firing guns at each other, or at others, and those of this ethnicity figure disproportionately in the records of offences involving urban shooting in an outdoor setting. Oddly enough, this is nothing new, and there was a spate of such activity in the year following the end of the First World War. Most people have heard of the Battle of Cable Street and remember it as being a brawl between communists and Jews on the one hand, and on the other Oswald Mosley and his black shirts. It has become an iconic incident in the fight against fascism in Britain. Few of those who celebrate this event, though, are even aware that there was a much fiercer and prolonged Battle of Cable Street over 15 years earlier, and that this was between black men and white ones. On April the 16th, 1919, the Times newspaper reported that last night there was a serious riot in the East End, arising out of a feud which has existed for some time between white and coloured seamen arriving at the Port of London. Trouble occurred at a number of cafes in Cable Street, near Leman Street. About 9:30, the neighbourhood was startled by the noise of firearms and the breaking of glass, and in a few minutes a crowd of men were engaged in a violent fight in Cable Street. It is unclear from subsequent reports just who was shooting at whom, but there is no doubt that revolvers were being fired during the disturbance. Knives were freely used as well, and 3 days later, a black man called Nathaniel Kassan appeared in court and was sent to prison for 6 months for stabbing a white man. Some of the other sentences received by participants in the riot strike us today as astonishingly lenient. Mohammed Ahmed, an Arab seaman, was fined just £2 for discharging a revolver during the riot. A month after the Cable Street riot, there were 4 days of rioting in the East End. This was also between black sailors and white mobs. Once again, firearms were used. On the 27th of May, at the height of the disorders, a Jamaican sailor called John Martin fired a pistol at the crowd surrounding the house where he was staying. He wounded a 27-year-old white man called James Hanrahan. On that same day, another black seaman called Charles Smith was spotted with a revolver in the Commercial Road. When challenged by the police, he threatened to open fire. There was more fighting and rioting in London in June, and then in August shooting broke out again in the East End when a white crowd pursued some black seamen. The sailors drew revolvers and began firing over the heads of the mob to discourage them. When the police arrived, they arrested the 3 men who had been shooting in the street. The magistrates took, once again, a very lenient view of the discharging of guns in the street. They were merely fined £1 each for possessing revolvers without a licence. The worst of the racial violence during the summer of 1919 took place in South Wales, of which Cardiff was the epicentre. In May there had been fighting between black and American sailors. A number of shots had been fired and 3 black men charged with attempted murder and shooting with intent to maim. It will be noticed that the use of firearms, invariably revolvers, was the exclusive province of the black men who were caught up in the rioting and disturbances. It is probable that some men at that time, fearing that they might be the victims of white mobs, had taken the precaution of arming themselves so they could frighten off attackers. The main rioting in Cardiff began on the 11th of June and was caused by a number of white men seeing a party of black seamen accompanied by white girls. Words were exchanged, which became heated. In no time at all, the whites were throwing bottles and stones, to which the black men responded by firing pistols. The police, who were quickly on the scene, were unable to cope with the situation and more shooting broke out. One black man was knifed. A crowd of white men besieging some lodging houses ended up being shot at. One of the houses was then set on fire. Not surprisingly, the police were far from enchanted to find that guns were being freely used on the streets of their city. They arrested all those upon whom they could lay their hands who had been handling or firing guns during the rioting. Muhammad Ali was found guilty that summer of shooting at the police in Cardiff, and so was Muhammad Khalid, who was convicted of firing at the police with intent to murder. It's curious to see that these men were not only black, but they were also Muslim. As it happens, they were Somali. Then, as now, the police found themselves playing piggy in the middle when disorder between two groups of angry men began, and much of the shooting, both in Cardiff and other cities, was at the police. The situation in Cardiff during June was now spiralling out of control, and it was felt in some quarters that the time was fast approaching when troops would need to be brought in to restore order. On June the 11th, a young discharged soldier called Harold Smart went up to a police officer in the street and said that his throat had just been cut by a black man. So it proved, because despite rushing the man to hospital in a taxi, Smart bled to death. Nobody was ever arrested in connection with this death. Another fatality in the riot was an Irishman called John Donovan, who was shot dead. The circumstances of his death showed that he was not exactly an innocent man. He had been part of a mob which was surrounding a house containing 11 black men. The white crowd stormed the house, and it was this which caused the trap men to try and drive back the attackers by firing at them. Donovan fell at once with a bullet through his heart. Police initially arrested all those who had been in the house which was attacked by the crowd. They subsequently released all but 2 of the men. These were charged with murder. When they appeared the following month at the Gloucester Assizes, the jury took a robust and common-sense approach to the case. The 2 men in the dock were charged both with the murder of John Donovan and also with discharging firearms at persons unknown. They were acquitted of both offences, the jury deciding that they had only been acting in self-defence. There can be no doubt that large crowds of white men outnumbered the black sailors who were the target of their anger at this time. But it's still interesting that it was the black men who seemed to be carrying guns which they did not hesitate to use. The summer of 1919 was a very hot one, and such weather is often marked by civil disorder of one kind or another. There was shooting in Liverpool as well that same year, um, in what was also known as a race riot. I just thought it was interesting to think about these cases because of the modern day association between Africans and Caribbeans and the use of firearms in the streets of British cities. It's interesting to look back on a case like this, which is over 100 years ago.